Good morning, church. My name is Pastor Corey. I'm the lead pastor here at Kent Cove. It is my joy to be with you this morning to continue our journey through the Gospel of Mark. Today we are in chapter 13, and we're going to be reading two sections, one at the beginning of the chapter, one at the end. Starting in verse 1, it reads like this. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us when these things will happen, and what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled?" Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name claiming, 'I am he,' and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains." Then picking up in verse 35, Jesus says, "Therefore keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch." Please join me in prayer. Bless us this day, O Lord, with vision. May this place be a sacred place, a telling space where heaven and earth meet. Amen. So this is one of those chapters that is challenging. In fact, this chapter, Mark 13, is called, by scholars, is called the Little Apocalypse. But when you read through it, it doesn't feel very little at all. It feels pretty weighty to me. Now, for those of us of a certain age, that whole topic, apocalypse, things that have to do with the end times, can be quite loaded. For me personally, one of the most formative experiences, and not a positive formative, a negative formative experience in my life, was begging my grandmother. I think I've told this story before. Begging my grandmother when I was, probably 10 or 11 years old, to go to Sunday evening Bible study with them because they were watching a movie. And I thought that would be cool. I was staying with them. Just me getting some grandma and grandpa time. And she, bless her heart, she tried to dissuade me. She said, "No, I don't think this is for you. I think maybe you should just stay home. We'll be home and soon." "No, Grandma, I really want to go." So I go, and they're watching this movie some of you maybe are familiar with called A Thief in the Night. Right? This movie created such abject fear in me that I was literally physically sick during the night from nightmares. And I, through the years, have talked to so many people who were scarred by the way that we talk about apocalypse. Right? Because instead of creating the sense that we just sang that our deliverer is coming, we get the sense that we're going to be destroyed, right? And so it creates this fear. And I think oftentimes for people, when we use the word apocalypse, we automatically go to destruction and all of this stuff. And literally, the word apocalypse simply means revelation or unveiling. You see, the whole idea of an apocalypse is not to hide things, it's to reveal things. And so when we look at this passage, this chapter, we have to do a little bit of work to understand what it is that's going on here. And the other reality is that when we use these words in the church, words that have to do with apocalypse, there's actually a couple of different ways that we use that word. So first, there's apocalyptic literature, which covers things like the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation. It's a genre of literature. It's a way they had of writing to tell a story, right? And then the second thing, the way it's used, is a social religious worldview that was operative and continues to be operative, that focuses on the cataclysmic end of the cosmos, right? So those are kind of the two realities that we need to be aware of as we enter this chapter. And really what we want to recognize is that while there is some foretelling going on, there are some other things going on that we can lose sight of if we get too caught up in this social religious worldview way of looking at apocalypse. So this whole chapter, I think, is designed to warn the disciples and us against 4 spiritual dangers. The first is a danger of relying on outward symbols of religion, as important and valued as they may be. The second is the deception by false messiahs. We didn't read that section, but as you read through 13, Jesus warns against that, says that there's going to be many false messiahs who come. And then the third is that of distraction by world turmoil around us, wars and the rumors of wars, right? Nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And that being distracted by that, we get tripped up because we didn't, maybe we didn't expect that level of turmoil. And then the last is that of being tripped up because of the unexpected severity of persecution for our faith. And so Jesus is setting up, as he talks about this, he's not just talking about the end of all things, he's also talking about how we are to be in the end of all things. As one commentator said, to be forewarned in each case is to be forearmed. In other words, Jesus is telling these things so that we might do exactly what he is telling us, which is to watch, to pay attention, to not get distracted. So the first thing we hear in this story, and in Mark 13, is the disciples and Jesus are leaving the temple. And in verses 1 and 2, it says this: as Jesus was leaving the temple, one of the disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." Jesus responds, "Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." So what you see on the screen is part of what we now call the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall in Jerusalem. This is all that remains of the Temple Mount from Jesus' time, right? Because in 73 AD, the Romans came in and they decimated the temple. They wiped it out. And Jesus' prophecy about the temple was fulfilled. It was destroyed. And this is all that remains. Now you can imagine, if we can kind of put on our imagination hats, if you're a disciple back then, imagine that this is just the foundation, right? That's all that's left. This was kind of the retaining wall of the Temple Mount. These stones are pretty big. So imagine as you, a disciple in that time, in that place, this is probably one of the wonders of the world in that age. The level of construction and the size of the construction. So for Jesus to say that not one stone will be left, it's going to be completely wiped out, would have been mind-blowing. Right? How is that possible? And yet the Romans did exactly that. And so Jesus, part of this warning is to not put too much reliance on those outward symbols. Because no matter how magnificent they are, no matter how helpful they are, no matter how much beautiful worship happens in that space, they are temporary. That temple was never meant to be the final place for God's residence. And Jesus wants them to understand that these stones, even though they look permanent, are not permanent. And so do not put your faith in those stones. Do not put your faith in these outward symbols of religion, in other words. Be careful where you put your faith. Then as we go through the text, Jesus says in verse 7, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. Those are the beginning of birth pains. I want to say a couple things about these verses. The first is that one of the challenges I think that we have as Christians, as followers of Jesus in the 21st century, is that we are more aware of what goes on around the world than any generation before us, instantaneously, right? I mean, think about that. A couple weeks ago, there were those devastating earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, and we knew within minutes of that happening. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it would have taken hours for us to hear about that. Days, even. And now we know instantaneously. And so we're overwhelmed with this sense of that everything's picking up speed and everything is so much worse now than it was then. And the fact of the matter is it isn't. Not really. It's just that we're aware of it. Right? The other thing I want us to recognize here is notice a couple of phrases that we tend to, if I'm not being generous, I would say ignore. If I'm generous, I would say miss, right? In this little warning that Jesus gives, he says, such things must happen, but the end is still to come. That's the end of verse 7. And then at the end of verse 8, these are the beginning of the birth pains. Right? Now, I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of ink spilled on looking at everything that's going on and talking about the end, right? We'll get to that in a minute. But Jesus is very clear here. He's saying that this is just the beginning. One pastor I heard talked about this and said, when you see, wars and rumors of wars and nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, all of the things that Jesus talks about here, in some sense we look at it and just simply say, well, welcome to life. Because it has been true ever since then, and it continues to be true. There are those things happening. But Jesus has said this is the beginning of birth pains. And then he goes on to warn us over and over that we should be on our guard, that we should be paying attention. And it's easy to get overwhelmed in the midst of all of that information, right? I was reminded as I was thinking about that of a story I love about John Wesley, the great Methodist one of the founders of the Methodist tradition. In 1835, John Wesley was sailing to Savannah, Georgia to take up a church there. And not only was he sailing there, he was the chaplain of the ship, right? So, man of God, clergy, all that stuff. Big storm happens. John Wesley is terrified. He is afraid for his life. Also on this ship was a group of Moravian pietists from Germany who apparently throughout this storm gathered and simply sang hymns and seemed to be very at peace with the world around them. And Wesley was struck by the peace that they had in the midst of the storm. And that's where one of those places where he talks about how his heart was strangely warmed, right? Because he witnessed that in the midst of the storm, these Christians had peace. And I think that's exactly what Jesus is talking about here. When Jesus says that, warns us that that nation is going to rise against nation, that there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, and he goes on to detail throughout this chapter a number of other things that are very disconcerting to experience. I mean, let's be honest about that, right? And yet Jesus is reminding us that as the storms rage, we may have peace. Do not be alarmed, Jesus says. This is nothing new. This is not a surprise to me. This should not be a surprise to you, right? And so as we go through these beginning birth pains, as we go through these trials that Jesus talks about, he's reminding us that we are not to be alarmed. We are not to fear. We are to remember that he is in the midst of it. Now, we get to verse 31. Now, obviously, we're skipping a whole bunch of stuff in here. But in verse 31 and 32, Jesus says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." And then he goes on to say, "But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." Now, I'm about to get myself a little worked up here. If there is a more ignored verse in the scriptures, I'm not sure I know what it is. Maybe Acts 1, where, it's the same sentiment is, told to the church. But we have spent so much energy and time on predicting, even though Jesus very clearly says, no one knows. I don't even know. So what you see scrolling on the screen, if you go to Wikipedia, you can see this. This is a list of all throughout history, all the predictions of the day and time when Jesus is coming back. Right? And if it wasn't so painful, it would be funny. Right? But it's like, we want to talk about following Jesus, and we want to talk about being people who take Scripture seriously, and yet we spend endless amounts of ink and energy predicting exactly what Jesus said we weren't to be predicting. Right? I mean, we could talk about the guy who puts on TV, right? Who puts up the enormous charts. I'm not going to say his name. Enormous charts about how it's going to work and when it's going to happen. And what happens is that exactly what Jesus was warning us against happens when we do this. We lose the forest for the trees. Now all of a sudden we're talking about signs and symbols and time and when will this happen and this is how it is. And then also we turn it into this kind of power trip, right? I know, you don't know, you better listen to me because I can read and decipher all these symbols and signs. The symbols and signs are not there to obscure, they're there to reveal. Jesus was not hiding anything. That's why he literally said what he said, that no one knows. Because there's some other words that he uses in this passage that are so important. He repeats it a number of times. Watch, be ready, pay attention. What Jesus is trying to get us to see is that in the midst of all of this stuff going on, in the midst of these birth pains happening, that we are to be about the kingdom life, living in the Jesus way, expecting him to return at any moment. He doesn't care if we know the day or time. In fact, he told us quite expressly that we would not. What he cares about is the kind of people we are while we wait. You see what I'm saying? Jesus is not interested in charts. Jesus is not interested in your premillennial, amillennial, all that other stuff. He's interested in, are you a kingdom person in the midst of this waiting? Right? living in the way of Jesus, expecting his return, not getting distracted by dates, times, charts, events, right? I remember very clearly at Bible camp as a kid, talking about Revelation, right? Because it's kind of titillating. I'm going to use that word, but, because it's fun to talk about, right? And of course, I'm a child of the 80s, so, the locusts in Revelation are the Soviet Hind helicopters, because they're, and then you got this and that and the other thing, right? And sure, it's fascinating, but how did that form me to be more like Jesus? It didn't. It just made me afraid. And I think it's pretty clear if you've ever read the New Testament, if there's one thing that Jesus tells us over and over again, it's not to be afraid. Jesus over and over again in this chapter gives repetitive warnings in both the beginning and the end of the chapter. Verse 5, watch out. Verse 9, be on your guard. Verse 23, be on your guard. Jesus' call for vigilance, it's everywhere, especially at the end of the chapter. Verse 33, be on your guard, be alert. Verse 35, therefore keep watch. Verse 36, do not let him find you sleeping. Verse 37, watch. No one knows. So, a couple of things. If no one knows, how do we understand then when we talk about apocalypse? Well, if apocalypse is revealing, then we have to recognize that when Jesus or John in Revelation or Daniel, when they use apocalyptic language, there's a reason for it. And the reason is that they are in a persecuted situation and they can't speak openly. And so they use code that people in that culture would have very clearly understood, right? And so open language is dangerous in those situations. And so they would talk in such a way as to be able to, that the Christians would understand, but the Romans wouldn't. That's the first thing. The second thing, and I've said this a couple times already, but symbolic language in apocalyptic is used to reveal, not confuse. The point isn't, you don't have to save up your 14 box tops and save 2 nickels to get the secret decoder ring, right? The symbols are there to show what's happening. They're not there to hide something. They're there to reveal something. Now, I'm not going to pretend that it would be easy for us as 21st century people to know all of the context of that. But I can guarantee you that when John wrote in Revelation about these locusts, he wasn't writing about Russian Hind helicopters. And then third, what apocalyptic is doing is it is calling us to faithfulness, not predictions. It is calling us to faithfulness, not predictions. Jesus, as he warns us repeatedly, watch, be on guard, pay attention, don't fall asleep, all of that, he's telling us to stay awake. Focus on what it is that I've taught you. Live in the way that I have taught you. So what does apocalypse mean for us? I think it's 2 things. One, it is warning. But sometimes I think it's not the warning that we think. The warning Jesus seems to be giving is don't get distracted by either religion or political upheaval. Or I might say, don't get distracted by religion or political power, right? Jesus is saying, if no stone is going to be left standing, that those outward symbols of religion are not what we put our faith in. If nation is going to rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, then political systems are not where we put our hope. And so Jesus is warning us, don't do that. But there is a comfort too. The comfort, I think, is that these things are not a surprise. We should not be surprised by this, nor should we be afraid of this. Instead, we should watch and be vigilant, not not to the distractions, but vigilant in the master's business. In other words, we should take seriously what we talked about last week when we talked about when Jesus boils the law down to loving God and loving others. This is such a deceptively simple metric for our lives. But if we are going to stay awake, and if we are going to be vigilant in the midst of these birth pains that Jesus talks about, I think one of the simplest metrics we can have for whether or not our lives are measuring up are if our actions, beliefs, and theologies and all of that stuff is causing us to love God more and to love our neighbor more. If it's not, then perhaps we need to rethink. Jesus wants us to be vigilant. He wants us to watch. He wants us to be aware. Not so that we can lord our knowledge of the end times over and cause fear in other people, but so that we love God more and neighbor more. Because that is the summation of the law. And that is the spirit and the heart of Jesus. And so my hope as we read these passages and as we experience life that can be so turbulent and so upside down and so broken that we won't get distracted by the details, but that we will rest in the hope that our deliverer is coming, and that while we wait, he expects us to live in the way that he taught us, loving God and loving others. Amen.